Canada's dominant grocery chains are facing heightened scrutiny these days, with record profits being reported at a time of soaring food prices, and they continue to rise even though inflation is coming down. Now, apart from parliamentary hearings, the industry will also soon be subject to a Competition Bureau report. So for a look at all of this, we're joined this afternoon by David McDonald, senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. David, good to talk to you about this. I mean, the cost of groceries impacts everybody in this country. You've all got to eat some way or another. So a lot of eyeballs were, of course, on Ottawa all week as these discussions have been going on. Before we get into sort of some of the alternatives, what did you make of the arguments put forward by Canada's grocery giants yesterday, effectively saying, look, it's not us, it's other factors. We're just, barely scraping by, is kind of the case being made.
Certainly, grocery store chains have thin margins, and their costs have been going up. There's no doubt about that. But just because you have thin margins doesn't mean you can't make money. And the margins in the grocery store industry have gone up from about 2%, where they stood prior to the pandemic, to about 4%, which is the value for 2022. So they've doubled their margins. Now, the question is, how have they doubled their margins? Where has that extra money come from? The chains themselves have argued that it's not actually on food. It's in some of their other areas, Shoppers Drug Mart, portion of Loblaws, for instance, being a profit driver there. And so therefore, Canadians are spending more on makeup and soap and not so much on groceries. And the markups are far higher on makeup and soap. And so that's where those markups are coming from. One of the big issues here is that these are the arguments they're making, but you can't see a lot of that data because they don't disclose it. Now, there is a Competition Bureau study that's due to be published in June looking at exactly this issue of food inflation. And so it may provide us with more detail. Now, the Competition Bureau can't compel these companies to give them any more data than is already out there, that anyone could see at any point. It did appear in the hearings, though, that these companies are disclosing additional information to the Competition Bureau, which may provide us with some additional insight into where these extra margins are coming from in these grocery store giants.
That really is kind of what it comes down to, isn't it? If they're pushing this narrative, especially when it comes to Loblaw about, clothing, pharma, and banking, that's really what's driving their profits, and that food, they're making like $1 on a $25 basket of goods, et cetera. Without really seeing that, when people are going to the groceries and paying so much and feeling the pinch, it's hard to believe, isn't it? So it's almost like essential that becomes part of this Competition Bureau look and investigation.
That's right. But the grocery store chains, of course, have to agree to it. The Competition Bureau has no power to compel them to provide this additional data, unlike in the U.S., where the FDA could compel companies to provide additional data. That's not the case in Canada. So, they were asked if this data in general would be disclosed, and they said, no, it will not, that they have secret agreement with these suppliers. I'm not sure that's terribly compelling. You could aggregate it up to a level where you wouldn't reveal any secret agreement details and would provide a lot more transparency, frankly, to Canadians. Broadly, though, there is a point to be made here that this food inflation isn't entirely the final point on the supply chain, which is these grocery stores. But there's a lot of people in between. There's the food manufacturers, there's oil and gas companies that provide diesel to farmers and provide diesel to truck these goods around the country. And broadly speaking, the big profits in this inflationary period aren't actually with grocers. They're rather with the oil and gas industry, the gas refining, banks, real estate. Those are the real big winners from inflation. Yeah. Grocery stores have certainly increased margins, but they're relatively small in the grand scheme of things.
And of course, the lack of competition in this country, effectively, when it comes to grocery stores, certainly makes the market sort of quite different. So you are with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. What are the potential policy alternatives that could be implemented in this country to perhaps either bring down or kind of control the cost when it comes to cashing out of the grocery store?
Yeah, I think at this point it's going to be pretty difficult to constrain those costs for this period of inflation. One of the things that has been done and we could do more of is provide more cash for low-income households that are forced to pay these higher prices. One of the ways you could fund those higher cash transfers to low-income households is increase the corporate income tax that was increased on banks and insurance companies to recoup some of the inflation money they're making. But I don't think there's any particular reason why it should be restricted to only that sector. Let's expand it to oil and gas. Let's expand it to the real estate industry, and let's expand it to grocery stores as well to help to fund maybe another round of aid to low-income families so they can afford these higher prices.
Absolutely. There are so many people really straining right now when they go to the supermarket and sort of putting food back on the shelves rather than taking it to the checkout. David McDonald, senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thanks for the time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.